Welcome. My name's Clarence Maybee, and I'm here today with my colleague Jean-Pierre Hérubel, and we're both from Purdue University. And we're going to talk about some work that we've done together to develop a typology that can be used by graduate students studying institutions, right? And it will help them to make better use of and understand institutional histories. So I'm going to spend a few minutes outlining some background to our work. Then I'll turn it over to JP, who will describe the typology and how it may be applied in our classrooms. JP and I have always been interested in how information literacy plays out in disciplinary and professional context. However, we realize that we take very different approaches to understanding what's going on in that space. And so in my research has always focused on understanding the experiences of people using information in different contexts, while JP, his work is always focused on identifying different information practices that are used in disciplines. So as we started working together, we started talking and thinking about how that research, the research that identifies different information practices, could be used and applied to support students' learning, which led to our current project that JP will now tell you more about.
Hello, I'm Jean-Pierre, and I am Clarence Maybee's colleague, and I will continue with our presentation. I would like to start with methods and approaches. An examination of publishing practices may shed light on constructions of authority within specific disciplinary communities. An analysis of published institutional histories from a large-scale bibliographic project informed the creation of the typology presented in this paper. The data derived from the bibliographic project provides illustrative examples of different kinds of institutional histories, such as university presses, administration, private publishers, etc. The identified types of institutional histories are arranged into a hierarchy of historical veracity, and a glossary is presented describing the characteristics of each, exemplifying how the glossary may be used in a learning context. An exercise is described in which students apply a typology in the examination of select institutional histories in a history of higher education course. Graduate students enrolled in a History of Higher Education course will have to engage with histories about individual colleges and universities. Too often, graduate students find that institutional histories vary in quality, focus, may be incomplete, or offer highly selective coverage, especially varying in historical methodology and historiography. How many graduate students effectively navigate the plethora of institutional histories in their research in higher education? How effective are their searches and their engagement with such sources? Upon first impression, many graduate students may view institutional histories as ceremonial artifacts, goodwill gestures dedicated to a celebratory narrative conveying the most positive approach to an institution's history. Institutional histories may emphasize the institution's humble origins, early foundational struggles, key features of successful achievements, while emphasizing key figures in its evolution. Often the narrative weaves a story that focuses firmly on the highlights and salient features that throw into relief a respective institution's most interesting aspects, especially administrative achievements and triumphs. Rarely do they focus on episodes that project a mediocre light. Institutional histories, especially as historical artifacts, present many challenges for graduate students researching an institution. To support their historical research, it is critical for them to ascertain the veracity of these sources as secondary and primary sources for historical research, especially if institutional histories are used for foundational purposes in analysis. For reputability, graduate students need to be able to ascertain institutional histories as verifiable historiographic tools. The hierarchy of institutional history is now what we will be presenting. By using this hierarchy, a graduate student may identify a given history's purpose, intent, and execution that conforms to a graduating hierarchy of historical veracity and adherence to historical best practices. The highest value is placed at the university press, peer-reviewed level, where scholarly apparatus and vetting guarantees a professional standard of historical scholarship. Critically differentiating between genres familiarizes graduate students with the complex nature of historical veracity exhibited by institutional histories. Not all genres can attest to strictly demarcated definitions. An institutional history may contain definitional elements from several genres presenting a multidimensional context. Some institutional histories are not identifiable as pertaining to and acceding to a single genre. For example, a scholarly trade publisher may publish the work of an academic historian author that is grounded in analytical use of primary sources and historiographic explication and methodologies, but accompanied by illustrations and visuals. Now I'd like to move on to the definitional glossary of types of institutional histories. To effectively support their efforts to identify, verify, and successfully navigate institutional histories, a definitional glossary is proposed that will provide a degree of verification with which graduate students pursuing primary resources can categorize and historiographically situate individual institutional histories. Using the glossary will allow students to answer questions that inform selection of a history or histories to further their research. Such questions may include: who is the author, background, relationship to institution? Is there more than one type of history for target institution? What genre of historical approach is used? What type of publisher published the account? Are their primary sources used judiciously and analytically? And this is very important for best practices, which Clarence and I are proposing. Does the history add to a wider contextualized history of higher learning? Applying the typology in a history of education course, we find that graduate students in a seminar focused on the historiography, or will focus on the historiography of institutional histories, use the glossary as they perform examinations of institutional histories individually selected among a predetermined list of histories. And from this example of institutional published histories, one can see that there is quite a diversity in terms of not date of publication, but the kind of veracity that some of these would actually be exposing students to. Applying the typology in a course, we are guided by the following questions. The exercise of reading and identifying characteristics outlined in the definitional glossary for each history permits the student to identify major and minor points that animate each history. Who is the author again? What is the author's intent? And this is very important. Often it's summarized in their introduction to the history. Our primary sources, documents utilized. This is very important in best practices for historical research, especially in history of higher education courses. Is the narrative focused on evaluative best practice historical research procedures? Are there illustrations, and how are they used? Are they just glossy? Are they just to offer a glitzy approach to the history, or are they actually holding some historical purpose that's important to the narrative? Is there an attempt to ground the history in a larger historical context? Does it consider the larger issues in higher education in which that university or college has to function? Who is the publisher? Which glossary entry fits the history and why? Sometimes there are several glossary entries that would fit a history. Why is that important, and why is it not important to the veracity of the history? Is the history grounded in the historiography of previous research on higher education? This is very important. In historical research, it is very important that students understand that they must embed their own research discovery within the context of that discipline's core literature. Is the history commissioned, and by whom? If it is commissioned, is it by the administration that has a vetted interest in what the history should be, or is it done in a very, very analytical fashion without regard to various aspects that might be unseemly or might be really grandiose in the eyes of the administration or whomever is very interested in producing that history? In conclusion, we would like to say that the use of institutional histories as primary sources to ground research in higher educational institutional history presupposes a requisite knowledge of what characteristic institutional histories possess and to their usefulness to sustained historical research. The exercise described in this paper exemplifies how the investigation of disciplinary information practices may inform the development of intellectual and historiographic tools to carry out historical work, requiring the ability to ascertain and situate institutional histories along a spectrum. And this is a very critical aspect of our work. Applicable to other disciplines, this paper highlights a process and benefits of drawing from the study of disciplinary publishing and other disciplinary dissemination practices to inform information literacy efforts in graduate educational settings.
Thank you. We look forward to seeing you at the Zoom session.